Who would have thought that Lydia Evans, once the daughter of a prosperous marquis, would be a prisoner in a labor camp? Anyone could say that this woman ruined her life because of her obsession with a man. Lydia was so in love with Richard that she completely forgot about caution and ended up at the bottom. What a fool she was to fall head over heels in love just because he comforted her when she cried. Besides, Richard was born to a commoner concubine and was the third prince, constantly watched by the heir, so a worse candidate for a husband was unimaginable. But Lydia foolishly believed in her family's power and proposed to him herself. Thanks to this engagement, Richard survived the palace intrigues, and when the heir ascended the throne and tyranny began in the country, he managed to stage a coup. Richard eventually managed to overthrow the tyrant and become emperor himself. Then he fell in love with Lydia's cousin Giselle and abandoned the heroine. Blinded by love, the girl decided that losing Giselle would be the most terrible blow for Richard. But the poisoning attempt failed, and Lydia ended up in a labor camp. Looking back, she thought it would have been better to just finish off that jerk Richard right away. In the 5th year of hard labor, Lydia contracted some infectious disease, and while the girl suffered in agony, her whole life flashed before her eyes. At that moment, she only thought about getting a chance to go back and slap that idiot. When the heroine opened her eyes, she found herself, for some reason, standing in the middle of a ballroom. Turning around, Lydia saw an enraged Richard heading towards her, having been informed that she had brought poison to poison Giselle. The girl lowered her head, and at that moment indeed saw a vial of poison in her hands. Lydia couldn't believe that she had returned to the past, to the very time when she was arrested. The terrible thing was that the heroine returned precisely at the moment of the attempted poisoning, when it was already too late to fix everything. While the girl was trying to figure out what to do, Richard ordered the soldiers to search her. Giselle stepped forward and offered to search her cousin herself, as it was not proper for men to do such a thing. Richard replied that he appreciated her concern, but asked her to stay behind him, as it could be dangerous. Lydia couldn't believe she had to come back just to witness this pathetic scene again. Suddenly, an idea came to her mind on how to fix everything, and the heroine swung her hand and slapped herself. Finally, Lydia saw everything crystal clear and decided not to ruin her own life for a man anymore. She understood that if they searched her, they would immediately find the poison, and then her fate would repeat itself. So the girl shed a tear and declared that she had been misunderstood and that the poison was intended for herself. Harming oneself was not forbidden by law, and since everyone already considered Lydia to be obsessed with men, she decided to stage a suicide attempt. If she died, Richard could have problems, and his reputation could hit rock bottom. The guests at the banquet were already whispering that he couldn't just let his former fiancée die like that. Everyone knew perfectly well that Richard owed his position precisely to the Marquis's daughter. Knowing that he would try to stop her so as not to become an outcast, Lydia decided to pretend to drink poison. But when the soldiers all rushed to save the girl at once, the vial flew out of her hands and a few drops of poison got into her mouth. Just at that moment, a man entered the hall, and in him the heroine recognized Arsène Bayern. Before she passed out, Lydia uttered his first and last name. Arsène caught her, trying to understand how the lady knew his real last name. The knights who accompanied Bayern at the event also heard Lydia say his name and decided that there might have been a secret romance between them. Glad that they hadn't heard the last name, Arsène denied it and ordered them to call a healer instead of idle chatter. Soon, all the maids were talking about how tenderly the Marquise's daughter looked at Sir Arsène when she tried to commit suicide. And because he carried her in his arms when the girl fainted, rumors of their affair spread. Arsène Edith was the captain of the Black Wolf Knights and the strongest sword in the Empire. It was thanks to this hero that the coup organized by Richard was successful. And while rumors that he was secretly in love with the Emperor's fiancée spread like wildfire, Arsène himself did not leave Lydia's bedside at Marquis Evans' estate. The man perfectly understood that his visit would only provoke the gossips, and although he didn't want to attract undue attention, there was no choice. Arsène needed to find out why Lydia called him Bayern, and why she tried to take her own life. The ducal family of Bayern was executed for treason, and so Arsène kept the secret of his origins deep in his heart. Suddenly, Lydia stirred and, in her sleep, complained about the cold. Arson wondered why no one in this house was looking after this sick woman. He took a bundle of firewood, went to the fireplace, and lit it to make the room warmer. Arson himself didn't understand how it happened that he came to interrogate Lady Evans, but ended up looking after her. When the heroine finally came to her senses and opened her eyes, the first thing she asked for was a drink. However, she never expected to see Bayern leaning over her bed. The girl tried to sit up, but Arson advised her to be careful while she was still weak and helped her sit down. Not understanding what he was doing in her room, Lydia thanked him for his help, and he replied that she was quite lucky to have woken up so quickly after being poisoned. The heroine herself understood this, as she had managed to be afraid that she would die immediately after returning to the past. However, the thought that she had managed to return from the dead instilled in Lydia the confidence that now she would live properly. And the first and most important rule of her new life would be the absence of men in it. A plan immediately formed in the heroine's mind, the first point of which was to save the people in the correctional facility. And of course, the girl couldn't resist the pleasure of getting revenge on Richard and Giselle. To pull all this off, Lydia needed Sir Arson, and their meeting couldn't have come at a better time. There was a man in the camp to whom Bayern owed a debt, and the heroine was sure that if she pressured him correctly, he would help her. As if nothing had happened, Lydia asked Arson why he was in her room. Deciding that she had forgotten about yesterday's events, the man became noticeably tense. However, when he did remind Lydia that she had called him Byron the day before, it was the girl herself who became tense. Despite her attempts to convince Arson that he had misheard, he insisted that he had heard everything clearly and had stayed in her room all night to find out everything. He needed to find out why the lady had called him Bayer. The heroine didn't know what to do, because with her lie, she could permanently undermine his trust. Trying to act casual, Lydia attempted to get his word that he would believe her. Nevertheless, Arson was not going to make such a promise, and dryly replied that he would listen first and only then decide whether to believe her. Warning him in advance not to be scared, Lydia confessed that she had actually died and returned to the past. It was in her past life, according to the girl, that she learned who he was. Stunned, Arson, hearing these words, thought that Lady Evans seemed not to have fully recovered yet. He decided it would be better to visit the girl in a couple of days, when she felt better. Arson was already heading for the door when Lydia exclaimed that it wasn't the ravings of a madwoman and that she knew where Byron was. Byron froze for a moment, then sharply turned around and asked her to repeat what she had just said. Then Lydia recounted that in her previous life, in a labor camp in the East, she had met his calligraphy teacher and governess. From these people, she learned that they had been caught helping Arson and his mother escape. The heroine didn't care if anyone thought she was crazy, but she needed to convince this man and secure his support, because only then could she save Byron, Nella, and Maria, thanks to whom Lydia had survived in the camp for 5 years. When her fiancé betrayed her and her family abandoned her, ironically, the only people who offered her a helping hand were those from the labor camp. Hearing Lydia in hysterics, Nella approached her and offered her food instead. Maria also supported her opinion, believing there was no point in grieving over someone who was already gone. In their past lives, those people shared food with Lydia, helped her with work, and smiled, even though she couldn't really do anything. And so in this life, the heroine really wanted to repay them for their kindness. She told Arson how, in the 5th year of penal servitude, they all decided to escape, but that winter, everyone died of the plague. If he still doubted her words, the girl suggested that Byron send someone to the east to verify. There, according to her, was a hidden mine of magic stones. Deciding that this should be enough to make him believe her, the heroine fell silent. However, contrary to her expectations, Arson decided that the girl must still be in deep shock from the broken engagement. And no matter how Lydia tried to stop him, the man stood up and apologized for disturbing the sick woman. Promising to visit her when the lady felt better, Arson hastily left the room. He declined the offer to dine with the young master, citing urgent business. No matter how much he thought about it, the idea that the girl had gone mad grew stronger in his mind. But nevertheless, Lydia knew too many details about Nella and Byron. Arson could not shake the feeling that he had fallen for some trick, but first, he had to check everything. In his opinion, the Marquise's family should have taken better care of the girl before she got worse, as if everyone had abandoned her. Perhaps that was why Lydia felt ill, and Arson even felt a little sorry for her. Meanwhile, the heroine's brother, Devin Evans, was extremely displeased that Sir Edith had declined his dinner invitation and left. He asked the butler's opinion about Arson having spent the whole day in Lydia's room. According to the servant, Sir Edith harbored tender feelings for the young lady. The butler thought it was evident in his eyes when he carried Lydia home in his arms. And although Devin was sure that there could be nothing between his sister and Arsène, the servant insisted otherwise. The guy smirked because he planned to let his sister die since she had disgraced the family. But now everything had changed, because who would have known that his foolish sister would hook up with Arsène? So he ordered the butler not to let Lydia go out and to take good care of her. A week passed since the commotion caused by the heroine's suicide attempt. During this time, while recovering, she thought through plans for various scenarios. The problem was that there was no news from Sir Arsène, although Lydia had also considered the possibility that he wouldn't help her. In any case, she needed an assistant, so she decided to ask Devin to lift the ban on leaving. When the girl entered her brother's study, he declared that she was just in time. He announced that His Majesty had chosen a match for Lydia, and now her fiancé would be Count Mond. The heroine was incredibly indignant that her brother had agreed to marry her off to an old man with a child. Smirking, Devin suggested to his sister that if she didn't want to marry an old man, she should cling to Sir Edith with a death grip. Without saying anything, Lydia ran out of her brother's study. Now she understood that he had been so kind to her only to get close to Arsène. Apparently, the traitor Richard himself decided to foist the old man on her, as he was afraid that she would marry Arsène. The heroine expected something like this, but when it actually happened, it made her very angry. However, she quickly pulled herself together and decided to become someone who couldn't get married and then leave with Arsène. And to achieve such a result, and kill two birds with one stone, Lydia decided to resort to a plan to become a priestess. Nobles often chose the path of divine trial after some public scandal. Becoming a cleric meant giving up servants and dates due to a vow of chastity, but the heroine didn't care. In the labor camp, she had to do even dirtier work than that. As for dates, Richard Liddy literally made her sick of them. Since the door to her room was blocked, the heroine made a rope out of sheets to escape through the window. Meanwhile, Arsène was making his way through the thickets of the Evans estate garden, hoping not to get caught. He couldn't come into the house officially so as not to cause chaos, so he chose this path, and all that remained was to find Lady Evans. Arsène sent people to the east, and they confirmed that there was indeed a labor camp there. He didn't want to send a letter so as not to attract unnecessary attention, and this was the only way to see Lydia. Just as Arsène looked up to find the girl's window among the others, he saw her climbing out of it and descending a makeshift rope. The heroine herself was barely holding on, as she relied on her body, hardened in the camp, and forgot that in this life she hadn't worked. And suddenly the girl heard Arsène's voice asking what she was doing there and if everything was all right with her. And while he was trying to figure out what Lydia had gotten herself into this time, the heroine felt her hand begin to slip. Noticing this, Arsène told the girl to jump and promised to catch her. Trusting him, Lydia let go of the rope, and a moment later the guy was already holding her in his arms. The girl was so light that Arsène even thought Devin was starving her. Lydia felt awkward because her clothes had ridden up during the flight, and she asked to be put down. The heroine was surprised by how Arsène became embarrassed by such a simple request to put her on the ground. However, the next second, Byron lifted Lydia and adjusted her dress. Now the heroine herself became embarrassed because she realized that Arsène had interpreted her words as a request to lower her hem. In absolute silence, his hand continued to touch her bare skin. Both their faces flushed, and it seemed as if breathing became more difficult. The awkwardness only dissipated because Lydia heard the maids looking for her around the estate. As soon as the maids turned the corner, Arsène instantly jumped from the balcony, holding the girl tightly in his arms. Once in the garden below, he gently lowered her to the ground. Only then did it suddenly dawn on him that up there, Lydia had asked him to lower her, not her skirt. Brushing aside his embarrassment, Arsène approached the heroine and offered to let her climb onto his back. He perfectly understood that the girl was trying to escape from the estate and intended to help her get out. Hanging on him was embarrassing for Lydia, but trusting him in the current situation was the most reasonable decision, so she agreed. And although Arson warned the girl to hold on tight, she had no idea how fast he would run. He raced through the garden like the wind, and yet his breathing didn't falter at all. And when Arson suddenly jumped from a great height, Lydia clung to him so tightly as if she was trying to choke him. Only when they left the estate and were on horseback did the heroine suddenly wonder why he had even snuck in to see her. Arson explained that he was trying to avoid rumors this way, because even the fact that he had carried her from the ball had caused a lot of gossip. However, when Lydia asked to be taken to the temple, Byron suddenly declared that he would not do it. According to him, although the young lady said she had met him in a past life, she obviously didn't know him at all. With a terrifying smile, Arson declared that he would never let go so easily of someone who knew his secret. Before her death, his mother instructed Byron to hide his true identity at all costs and trust no one. On his 9th birthday, Arson lost his father and grandfather, as his entire family was ordered to be executed for treason by order of the former emperor. Only the boy and his mother survived. Back then, during their escape, they even lost Arson's teacher, Byron, and his governess, Nella. After long wanderings, they found refuge on the outskirts of the marquisate, where their father's closest friend, Abraham Edith, lived. But soon after, his mother died of illness, and so the boy became Arson Edith. Standing over his mother's grave, he replayed her last words in his head. Ever since then, Arson was not used to trusting people, even if the girl in front of him wouldn't hurt a fly. Only after finding herself in some house did it suddenly dawn on Lydia that she had been kidnapped. So that the girl wouldn't escape, Arson tied her up with a blanket using a strong knot. The abductor advised her to sit still, claiming that no one would help her in this place. He didn't even deny that he would kill her if necessary, should she dare to scream. Judging by his behavior, Lydia guessed that Arsène already knew about the labor camp. Byron confirmed her guess and added that he had also found out what happened to the nanny and the teacher. And although Lydia considered this great news, Arsène didn't understand why she was happy, because he no longer needed her information. Nevertheless, the girl herself held a completely opposite opinion. She knew that Arsène wanted to acquire the borderlands of the Marquisate, and for that, he might need her knowledge. However, Edith replied that Viscount Devon and His Majesty had already promised him these lands. The heroine smiled and called Sir Arsène very naive. Only a naive person could believe that someone who had deceived his fiancé would keep a promise made to a stranger. Lydia wasn't lying. Until her death in the previous life, Arsène never did receive those lands. She stated that as soon as Devon realized Edith needed the land, he would never give it up. However, if Arsène marries Lydia, which her brother definitely wants, then he will give this land as a dowry. Catching his cold gaze, the heroine asked Sir Edith not to worry, as she was not going to ask him to marry her. All she needed from him was help, and in return, she promised to help him. First, Lydia needed to cure her father and win him over to her side. Devon seized power in the family only because their father fell ill. However, the girl refused to say exactly how she intended to do it. Lydia was not so foolish as to lay all her cards on the table before someone who threatened to kill her. It greatly angered her that Arsène did not believe she knew the future, even after he discovered the camp. Arsène, in turn, was annoyed that Lady Evans wasn't going to tell him how she knew who he was, but he still saw some sense in her words. The current emperor was too similar to the successor of the previous ruler, and such people could not be trusted. Arsène understood that it was foolish of him to cling to promises without any guarantees. But the problem was that he couldn't trust this girl either. Not only did she talk about immunity to poisons, but she also spouted some nonsense about dying and returning to the past. It was still better than doing nothing, and it was safer to keep Lydia close and under supervision. So Arsène sighed and asked what exactly was required of him. The heroine asked him to take her to the Marquisate border after he rescued the people from the camp. And when Lydia asked to be taken to a temple before that, Arsène sarcastically asked if she was going to atone for her sins. The The heroine laughed, knowing perfectly well that she was not at all like someone who would repent, and announced that she wanted to become a nun. Surprise was etched on Arsène's face, so Lydia explained that it was just a cover so she wouldn't be married off. After Edith promised to return for the girl the next day to escort her to the temple, she extended her hand to him as a sign of sealing their agreement. However, instead of returning the handshake, Arsène adjusted the blanket on her. He refused to untie the girl and reminded her that she was still in her pajamas. Arsène promised to find some suitable clothes for her in the morning, and for now, advised her to go to sleep. Since this was Sir Edith's bedroom, Lydia was about to go to the guest room. However, Arsène threw the tied girl onto the bed, dryly cutting her off, saying that she would sleep here. The heroine blushed with embarrassment and asked if that meant they would be sleeping together. Lydia noticed how taken aback he was by her question and immediately hastened to correct herself. According to her, she knew that nothing would happen between them, as Sir Arsène was clearly not the type who would want that. Bayern, in response, advised the girl to be more careful, as she apparently didn't see him as a man at all. Leaning over Lydia, he asked why she was so sure that he couldn't have dirty thoughts. Blushing even more, the heroine confessed that Richard had told her that no man in his right mind would get involved with her. Therefore, she asked Arsène for forgiveness if she had offended him with her words. Bayern was struck by how the emperor could say such a thing to his own fiancée. He confessed that he had no intention of slandering the lady's honor and only wanted to warn her in case of unforeseen circumstances. An awkward silence hung in the room, and Arsène hastily headed for the door, leaving the girl to rest. And at that very moment, in the absolute silence, Lydia's stomach suddenly rumbled so loudly that Bayern turned around. The heroine turned away and hid her face under the blanket, burning with shame. She hoped that Arsène, as a gentleman, would pretend he hadn't heard anything. However, despite this, the man again approached her bed and asked if she was hungry. Although Lydia initially refused, after a while she was happily devouring her dinner. Seeing how eagerly the girl ate, Arsène became even more convinced that she wasn't properly fed at home. The way she gnawed at her food, Lydia reminded him of a winter rabbit, and he couldn't help but say it out loud. Arsène said that it was an animal with pink fur living in the northern forests, which can often be found at the border. The heroine's imagination immediately pictured a cute rabbit, and she decided it would be nice to get one. However, in Arsène's opinion, it would be quite difficult for a lady to have such a pet. Meanwhile, at the imperial palace, the doctor examined Giselle and concluded that the baby was perfectly healthy. And although this greatly pleased the expectant mother, Richard was so deep in thought about something that he didn't even hear the doctor's words. When Giselle noticed this, the emperor apologized and confessed that he was concerned about Lydia's relationship with Arsène. The woman sadly lowered her head, as she thought Richard still had feelings for his former fiancée. The emperor embraced his wife and explained that his concern was related to Arsène. He wanted to keep Edita in the capital at all costs and make him the night guardian of their future baby. In Richard's opinion, his marriage to Lydia could become a problem. Giselle was ready to visit the Marquis's estate if it worried the emperor so much. She planned to meet Devon and find out all the details. The next morning, the heroine woke up to a persistent knock at the door. And although she expected to see Sir Arsène behind the door, an unfamiliar man stood on the threshold. He announced that Sir Edith had told the girl to get dressed and come out. The man looked at Lydia so angrily that she felt uneasy, and suddenly he declared that she was no match for their captain, and if the lady was hoping for something, she'd better give up right now. The heroine was so shocked that she didn't even know what to say in response. The man added with a smirk that she who couldn't keep an emperor by her side wouldn't be able to keep a captain. Lydia didn't understand why the man, whom she was seeing for the first time in her life, was being so rude to her. When asked his name, he replied that she didn't need to know it, as __quote _0___ were not to his taste. The heroine flushed with indignation at how he dared to speak to her like that. At that moment, Arsène approached her from behind and asked why the lady was staring so angrily into the empty corridor. The girl turned around and at first thought of complaining to him about that man. However, because they still had to go to the border together, Lydia decided not to escalate the situation. Arsene said that last night he had sent people to the Marquis's estate, so they needed to go to the temple immediately. The priest was surprised to see Lady Evans at the temple at such an early hour. The girl said that as a devoted servant of the goddess Anastasia, she had come to dedicate her life to serving her. According to Lydia, the goddess had opened her eyes to how empty her life was without this. The priest smiled, but at the same time he thought about how the temple's reputation would suffer if they accepted her as a novice. Declaring that she wanted to sacrifice everything to be useful to the goddess, Lydia opened a book, among whose pages a huge gemstone was hidden. The priest was taken aback, as this was a bribe for him to agree to make Lady Evans a nun. Composing himself, he accepted the offering, citing the teachings of the goddess Anastasia, according to which even a small act of kindness should not be ignored. The girl knew that a witness would be needed for the vow of purity, and so she had already taken care of everything. The priest reminded her that only the most worthy person could be a witness. Lydia asked him not to worry about it, as her witness would be Her Majesty, the future Empress. Last night, the heroine gave Arsene a letter asking him to deliver it to Alice from the barony of Melvern. In it, she asked Giselle to come to the ceremonial temple the next morning. Giselle wanted to be adopted into the family of Marquis Evans before the wedding. Although she was a relative of Lydia, she was essentially an orphan from a distant, collateral branch of commoners, and Richard also had an inferiority complex due to his origins. But now that her father was seriously ill, Devon and Lydia's consent was required for the adoption. That's why the heroine was sure Giselle would come, and she wasn't wrong. The girls exchanged pleasantries, and then Lydia asked if she should now address her cousin formally. Giselle waved her hand, stating that such formalities were unnecessary between sisters, and she wasn't going to act as if she were of higher status than Lydia. And while Lydia tried to make sense of her words, Giselle thought that she probably had nothing with Sir Arsene, since she had decided to become a nun. And suddenly, the heroine confessed that she wanted to be frank with her. She declared that she would not forbid Giselle from using her surname, but at the same time, she did not intend to consider her a true sister. And although the future empress was initially taken aback, she then smiled and replied that this was enough for her. The ceremony, with Giselle present, went smoothly, but when Devon found out about it, he was furious. Lydia not only informed her brother that she had become a nun, but also of her intention to go with Sir Arsene to the outskirts of the Marquis's estate to build a temple there. Devon couldn't believe it, and asked Sir Edith if he had indeed given his consent. Arsene confirmed Lady Evans' words and announced his intention to accompany and protect her. Devon didn't understand why he had to take his sister, who had become a nun, to such a remote place. This led him to think that Arsene had feelings for Lydia, even if she didn't reciprocate. Devon stated that he had no reason to object if Sir Edith agreed. In reality, he was thinking that Lydia could always leave her life as a nun, and they just needed to fall in love. He believed that if his sister suffered enough in that wilderness, she would rely on Arsene, and feelings would ignite within her. Therefore, before ending this conversation, Devon forbade Lydia from taking anything from the estate with her. In his opinion, since she had become a nun, she should now live modestly and take only a few clothes with her so as not to freeze. And while the heroine was seething with anger at this petty jerk, Devon offered Arsene a cup of tea. Sitting down at the table, Evans asked Edith since when he had been so close with his sister. Arsene replied that they weren't exactly close. He just thought it was a good idea to build a temple on the border. Devon watched the man carefully as he spoke and concluded that he was a very callous person. He decided to act independently and first suggested to Arsene that he confirm his sister was indeed a beauty. Since Edith didn't answer, he continued to talk about how worried he was that some scoundrel might bother Lydia at the border. Devon asked him to take care of his sister and to be the first to hug her if she looked lonely. And although Arsene noted that these words could lead to misunderstanding if someone heard them, the guy laughed. He stated that Sir Edith was a true gentleman, and that's why he liked him. Arsene looked at him and wondered if the Marquis had always been someone willing to sell his sister instead of genuinely caring for her. Until now, he had considered Devon a decent man, as he had fought alongside the current emperor during the counter-revolution. But now, Arsene was becoming increasingly convinced that Lydia's words were true. Devon is the kind of person who would easily break a promise for their own benefit. Arsene no longer wished to stay in that house and stood up, citing that it was time for him to prepare for his departure. He also announced that the trip would take place in 2 days. It turned out that they would not stay in the capital until the wedding, although, according to Devon, he understood that Lydia would not have wanted to be there anyway. When Arson left the living room, he ran into Lady Evans in the hallway, and although the girl had planned to meet him in 2 days, he suddenly became indignant about how she intended to stay in such a place. And since Lydia only needed to pack a couple of dresses, Arson suggested she do it right away and leave with him. The heroine thought for a moment, and then suddenly, sharply grabbed Sir Edith by the collar and pulled him towards her. With a sly smile, she whispered to Arson that she had some business to attend to. And although she didn't elaborate on the details, her plan was to take more than just the dresses after Devon had acted so petty. Her father was in a castle subordinate to the marquisate, but Lydia knew that the family jewels were still at the estate. Therefore, she intended to take with her the entire contents of Marquis Evans' safe. Her father himself told Lydia about the safe in case of an emergency, so the girl went to his study. Suddenly, her attention was drawn to a large object covered with a sheet. Deciding that Devon had hidden something, the heroine brushed away the fabric and froze in horror. There was a coffin with her father's name engraved on it, even though the man was still alive. It was incomprehensible to the girl that this insane fool had already prepared a coffin for their father. Although Marquis Evans was not a good husband, he was a decent parent and did not deserve such treatment from his son. Moreover, he highly valued blood ties and always stood by his children, no matter what they did. The heroine covered the coffin again, confident that it would never be needed, no matter what Devon did. Finally, among the books, Lydia managed to find the right casket. It was full of diamonds, which her father had spoken about. After the success of the uprising, before Lydia's departure to the capital, the Marquis told her about the safe and allowed her to use it if needed. Apparently, he knew that his daughter would be penniless, supporting Richard with everything she had. The heroine mentally promised her father to manage the valuables wisely. Besides, she planned to definitely save him, and he just needed to wait a little. Arson paid a visit to the emperor to inform him that he would not be attending his wedding. Richard already knew that he was taking Lydia with him, who planned to build a temple on the border. Since she had only recently become a nun, the emperor believed that for now, everything should be quiet. Although, on the other hand, Lydia could leave the ministry at any time. Therefore, he told Arson that he respected his intentions, but still advised him to be more careful with Lady Evans. Compared to Richard, who had recently ascended the throne, Devon already wielded great power, and an alliance with Arson and the Knights of the Black Wolf could become dangerous. Therefore, the emperor needed to prevent Edith from getting close to Lydia. To clear up the misunderstanding, Arson stated that he had no relationship with Lady Evans, and he had no intention of starting one. He swore on his sword that he had no feelings for this girl. In response, Richard sneered and declared that no one would want to marry a disgraced woman. Arson glared angrily at the emperor, for he was the scoundrel who had disgraced and abandoned the lady. The man didn't understand why everyone around treated Lydia so carelessly. 2 days later, when he arrived at the marquisate for Lady Evans, she looked unwell. And although he suggested that the girl postpone the trip, she insisted that she was just tired and everything was fine. Arson thought the young Marquis was mistreating the lady again. Before they left, Devon handed his sister a document regarding Giselle's adoption for her signature. And while Lydia was signing the papers, he went over to her belongings to check why they looked so heavy, if there were only supposed to be a couple of dresses inside. The heroine tried to stop her brother, but he had already opened the satchel, exposing her underwear. Arson tactfully turned away, embarrassed by such an awkward situation. Lydia rushed to her belongings, shouting that even priestesses need underwear, and her brother's behavior was out of line. Devon thought his sister had hidden something in the bag, but she really had only packed clothes. So he apologized and declared that they could now leave. Lydia walked past Arson without lifting her head and called him to follow her. In the carriage, the girl still sat with her head down, not saying a word. Arson looked with regret at Lydia, who seemed very dejected after such humiliation. Still, constantly carrying the bag with her was hardly convenient, so he suggested the lady put it on the floor. However, Lydia only clutched the satchel even tighter, claiming it contained very expensive lingerie. It was literally very expensive, as the heroine had prudently sewn diamonds into it. As Arson continued to insist that the girl put down the bag, she offered to let him look at the lingerie to see how special it was. Edith blushed and refused, stating that he was not a pervert. In his opinion, Lydia was too loose for a nun, and Arson, in her opinion, acted like a prude. Then she asked him to stop calling her lady and to address her as a nun. Since Arson had warned the heroine that they would stop at an inn along the way, Lydia asked how long it would take. Edith planned to get there in the evening, then discreetly slip away and head to the labor camp. They needed to save the people before the rest of the group arrived in the market. And since the journey promised to be grueling, Arson clarified whether Lydia truly intended to go with him. The heroine smiled and assured him that she was fine. She didn't care how hard it would be because they could save the people in the labor camp. After arriving at the inn, Sir Arson and Lydia headed east with only a few subordinates. First, Edith introduced his loyal comrade Randall Milan to the girl. After that, he introduced Lydia to his adjutant, Cedric. The heroine was glad to see him, as she had known him in her past life as a very kind person. She smiled and said she was glad to meet Sir Raymond, revealing that she knew his last name. And although Cedric was touched that Lady Evans remembered his last name, Randall, unlike him, snorted discontentedly. It was then that Lydia remembered that this guy was the same boor who had spoken to her so rudely at Arson's house. Cedric began to apologize for his friend, and the heroine pretended that such an attitude didn't bother her at all. And although she wanted to avoid problems this way, Randall's behavior was completely out of line. Until their arrival in the East, he would either start groundless quarrels or stare at Lydia whenever she spoke to Arson. And although the heroine tried her best to ignore it, such behavior did not escape Edith's attention. Randall made no secret of the fact that he wouldn't have complained about anything if that woman hadn't been with them. To lighten the mood, Cedric playfully cuffed his friend on the back of the head, stating that the boy must be very tired. When Arson asked if anything had happened between Lydia and Randall, the girl replied that he simply didn't seem to like her. She wondered why Sir Edith was asking such questions, unless he was his father or they were dating. And suddenly, a stunning realization came to the heroine. Sir Arson was incredibly handsome, and yet he had never had a single scandalous romance. And so many ladies of the capital had tried to get close to this man. The heroine suddenly thought that Randall got rid of all the women who approached Edith. Looking at the girl, Arson advised her to dismiss whatever she might have imagined. He angrily denied Lydia's assumption that he and Randall were romantically involved. In that case, the heroine had no idea why the guy was behaving that way towards her. A little later, the whole company reached the hotel, which was as close as possible to the labor camp. Cedric once again apologized to Lydia for Randall, who, according to him, was going through difficult circumstances. The heroine frowned and asked what circumstances could make a person behave that way. Cedric told her that most members of their knightly order were mercenaries or commoners. They received knighthoods for their contribution to the success of the rebellion in the country, and Randall came from a family of serfs, feudal dependent peasants, in other words, slaves. Therefore, everyone in the squad except Milan received a knighthood. The heroine realized that Randall had an inferiority complex because he was a knight in name only. Cedric reminded Lydia how, after a victory, he once recommended Milan as her escort knight. But Lady Evans was indignant then and declared that a serf could not be a knight. The heroine was horrified by what she heard, as at that time she was obviously an aristocrat to the core, in the worst sense of the word. Moreover, she lived under the illusion that she would soon marry Richard and become a member of the imperial family. Only now did it suddenly dawn on Lydia what an arrogant bitch she had been. To think she had offended someone and didn't even remember it. Perhaps Lydia returned to the past to live a more dignified life this time. The heroine thanked Cedric because if it weren't for him, she would have made an even bigger mistake. And although it was already late, she decided to apologize to Randall right away and went upstairs. However, on the way, Lydia ran into Arsène, who asked her to prepare for departure. He advised to postpone the conversation with Randall for another time, as the clouds had very conveniently covered the moon, and it was the perfect moment to sneak into the labor camp. Meanwhile, in the labor camp, Maria collapsed to the ground, begging the goddess to send her a piece of bread with sugar. Nella offered the girl her bread and handed her the loaf. Although Maria refused, the woman convinced her that pregnant women need to eat well. The girl replied that she was joking and just tired, so she went to sleep. In reality, this was a lie. Maria was indeed very hungry. When she thought about her child possibly being born sick because she herself hadn't eaten enough, a wave of guilt washed over her. The girl was almost asleep when she suddenly smelled bread and then heard someone waking her up. Lydia tried to wake Maria, who, half asleep, thought it was Nella trying to feed her again. However, when she finally opened her eyes, she flinched in fright, not understanding who was standing before her. An unfamiliar girl in a cloak offered her fresh pastries, gestured for her to be quiet, and whispered for her to follow. Seeing bread sprinkled with sugar in the bag, Maria decided that a goddess had appeared before her. Lydia smiled and replied that she was simply a nun who had received enormous help from her, and now she had come to take her with her. The girl promised to explain everything in more detail later, but for now, all that was required of her was to trust her. When Maria stood up, she asked permission to bring someone else with her. Lydia smiled and replied that if she was talking about Byron and Nella, they were already there. When Maria saw Arsène, she immediately understood that he was the one her friends had been so desperately looking for, and the heroine confirmed her guess. When everyone was gathered, Lydia suggested leaving the camp as soon as possible. She knew that the guards were patrolling the opposite side at this time, and for now, the path was clear. They were about to head straight into the forest when suddenly, footsteps were heard from behind, and the light of a lantern illuminated the faces of the fugitives. The closer the man came, the more they were gripped by the fear of being caught. But suddenly, Lydia recognized Robert's grandfather in the stranger and involuntarily uttered his name. And while the man wondered how she knew him, the fugitives breathed a sigh of relief. Robert guessed that they were all about to escape and pondered for a moment. Then he decided it was none of his business and turned around, advising the fugitives not to get caught on the way. According to Robert, he didn't have much time left, and they, being young, needed to get out and live a decent life. The old man had almost left when Lydia rushed after him and offered him to come with them. However, Arsène pulled the girl back and reminded her that they hadn't agreed to that. Nevertheless, Lydia was sure that Grandpa Robert would be very useful to them, as he was an expert in mining, and there were mines on the border. So she turned to her grandfather again and suggested they take the chance to escape. The others also supported the girl and invited Robert to come along. The man agreed, but asked them to abandon him if he became a burden, as he didn't have much time left to live anyway. This is how Lydia and Arsène managed to help 4 prisoners escape. On the way, Edith felt as if something was bothering the girl, and he asked her about it. The heroine admitted that her butt hurt from such a long horse ride. Arsène once again asked her to refrain from vulgar expressions. But Lydia saw nothing wrong with naming a body part. After all, she wasn't asking him to give her a massage or rub in ointment. Arsène warned that he would make her walk if she ever mentioned it again, as he had no desire to ride on the same horse with a pervert. And when Lydia reminded him that he had forgotten to call her a nun again, Edith stated that he simply couldn't bring himself to say it. Then the heroine suggested he just call her by her first name, but when she heard her name from his lips, she suddenly blushed. Arsène himself blushed, turned away, and for some time they rode in complete silence. This silence was quite awkward, but soon Sir Edith broke it. He asked the girl if she meant the silver mine in the borderlands when she spoke of mines. According to the information Arsène had, that mine was unprofitable, and even the previous marquis had abandoned its development. However, Lydia replied that he knew too little, because where there is silver, there can also be deposits of magic stones. She admitted that she had heard about it from Grandpa Robert himself in her past life. And while the girl was speaking, Arsène was thinking that she had started all this nonsense about death and returning to the past again. He had inquired about her past but found nothing suspicious. She had lived her entire life in the capital, had no connection to the Byron house, and could not have known Byron and Nella. However, it was hardly possible to lie so smoothly. Everything turned out to be true: the labor camp in the east, and the people Arsène was looking for. Moreover, upon meeting the old man, Lydia was the first to call him by name. It was increasingly beginning to seem to Arsène that this girl had indeed died and returned to life. Suddenly, the heroine distracted him from his thoughts and demanded a substantial percentage if they indeed found magical stones there. With this money, she planned, once she was done with her revenge, to go to a warm island somewhere in the south, as she couldn't stand winter. This seemed quite logical to Arsène, because if Lydia had indeed been in that camp, it was no wonder she had come to hate the cold. Although perhaps it wasn't just about winter, and he asked the girl if it was possible that she simply detested the empire itself. The heroine turned and gave Arsène a long look. Then she finally smiled and admitted that this could also be considered a reason. And at that moment, as Arsène looked into her radiant face, he suddenly thought that winter did not suit her at all. He pulled Lydia's fallen hood over her head and said that her idea about the South was simply excellent. Soon the whole company reached the inn on the outskirts, where dinner was served for them. As everyone sat down at the table, tears suddenly streamed from Nella's eyes. The woman confessed that only now did she realize that everything was already over. She was glad to see her master alive and asked if he had been wounded, but Arsène replied that he should have been the one to ask that question and apologized for not finding them for so long, as he didn't know they were in such a terrible place. Byron was very glad that the master had finally managed to find them, but he was curious about who this nun was who had led them out. The heroine hesitated with her answer, but Maria didn't let her say anything. She apologized for interrupting them, but the girl was concerned about why she had been saved if she had no connection to the Byron house. And although everyone else also wanted to hear the answer to that question, Lydia understood that these people didn't need to know the truth. There was no need for them to know how terribly she had suffered in her past life before dying of the plague. The heroine decided to keep these nightmarish memories to herself and declared that they wouldn't remember her anyway. And although Lydia couldn't explain everything in detail, she asked them to take her word for it that she was deeply indebted to all of them. Then she turned to Richard and made a special request to him. The girl said that there was a mine where they were going, and she needed him to check it for magic stones. In addition, she would be grateful if her grandfather would lead the development of that mine. Richard lowered his head, stating that he thought he was being rescued, but in reality, they wanted to put him to work in another mine again. This amused everyone, and the casual conversation at the table continued. At some point, the heroine noticed Randall stepping outside. She excused herself and hurried after him, citing a desire for some fresh air. However, when Lydia stepped out the door, she didn't find the guy outside. As soon as the heroine called Sir Randall, he suddenly appeared behind her, as if from nowhere, and sarcastically remarked what a great honor she had bestowed upon him by calling a commoner Sir. The girl shrieked in fright, and he, with a displeased look, asked what she wanted from him. Lydia stepped towards Randall and confessed that she had come to ask for his forgiveness. She explained how she had learned from Cedric that she used to look down on Milan because of his status. Contrary to his assumption that the captain made the girl apologize, it was her personal initiative. Lydia, though late, realized she had hurt Randall, but she wasn't going to force him to accept an apology. However, Milan didn't understand why the girl apologized then if she didn't need his forgiveness. The heroine guiltily lowered her head and pondered. Then the girl smiled and replied that she just wanted him to know that she would never do that again. If she started her old ways again, Lydia was ready to take a hit from Randall. The guy discontentedly stated that a knight cannot raise a hand against a girl, and although the heroine tried to explain herself further, Randall declared that it was enough and turned away. Finally, he added that he never held a grudge, and he just felt uncomfortable. When they returned to the hotel lobby, Arsène breathed a sigh of relief, because he was already ready to break the two of them up. All of this was quite strange because before, Lydia would have rather gotten angry and slapped Randall. And anyway, ever since Arsène contacted her, everything around them had become strange. Lydia knew not only his true identity, but she also knew about the governess and teacher he had been looking for his entire life. The girl had changed so much, as if she had truly been reborn. Arsène finally decided to admit that no matter what had happened, Lydia Evans was no longer as arrogant and domineering as she had been in the past. It was a warm, sunny day. Lydia ran up to Byron, took his hand, and called him to come and have fun with her. Arsène flinched and opened his eyes, trying to understand what that strange dream was. It was very early morning, but when he went downstairs, he saw Byron, who was also already awake. It turned out that he and Nella were so excited about what was happening that they couldn't get any proper sleep. Arsène looked at them, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still dreaming. He thought he would never see these people again, but they were standing right before his eyes, alive. And if it hadn't been for Lydia, he would have searched for them much longer, or perhaps never found them at all. Just as Arsène was wondering if he had thanked Lady Evans, she also came down to join the others. Byron looked at her sleepy face and couldn't shake the thought that she resembled a cute little bunny. The heroine felt his intense gaze and asked why he was looking at her like that. Arsène was initially flustered, and then admitted that he wanted to thank her. He expressed his gratitude for the fact that it was thanks to Lydia that he was able to find his nanny and teacher. And although the girl tried to convince him that it was in her interest too, Arsène still continued to insist on his point. Nevertheless, he finally agreed that it was too early for gratitude, as they still had to escape and cross the east. The girl was determined to set off that very minute, but Arsène reminded her that she was still in her nightgown. Lydia was embarrassed by his remark, and he himself found the situation very amusing. At first, the heroes thought of returning the same way they had started the journey, that is, by dressing Milan as a merchant. However, since the fugitives could be spotted at the checkpoint, they were hidden among the cargo in the cart. The heroine knew that Milan was going to bribe the checkpoint to get through much faster, so she asked him to hand over 2 more gold buttons along with the other coins. These buttons had fallen off Devon's jacket cuffs, and they had the Evans family cross engraved on them. Lydia was counting on the buttons, once they were given to the soldier as a bribe, to spread throughout the Count's territory, and the heroine wanted to observe the reaction. Richard didn't know about the existence of the underground labor camp, and the girl was curious how she ended up there in her past life. That's why she suspected that Devon might have been involved in some way. Meanwhile, the news that Lydia had become a priestess spread throughout the capital. Devon was furious because the source of these rumors was the imperial palace. Obviously, Richard was deliberately spreading this news, as he was determined to keep Lydia away from Arsène. Since the rumor was not false, Devon could not openly deny it, as he did not want to go against the emperor. But he couldn't sit idly by, so he summoned the butler and ordered him to tell Giselle to visit the marquisate. When the future empress arrived, she immediately asked her cousin not to worry about these rumors. However, Devon couldn't help but worry if these rumors could shackle his sister's future. Giselle explained to him that if these two were truly in love, nothing could stop them, because Lydia could always refuse to serve the goddess. What worried her more was when Devon himself was going to get married. According to Giselle, ever since she became part of the Evans family, she's been worried that the lineage might end. Devon smirked when the girl suddenly, as if by chance, mentioned his first love, whom, according to rumors, he hadn't forgotten yet. It all started with simple flattery, and now Giselle was meddling in affairs that weren't hers. Devon realized she wanted something more than just their family name, and decided to ask her directly about it. Giselle didn't deny it, and he suggested she tell him directly what she wanted. And then she asked if Devon would accept her second child as an heir if he remained unmarried. The thought flashed through the young man's mind that if he adopted the prince, Richard would no longer be able to easily disown the Evans family. The offer was quite intriguing, so he promised Giselle he would think about it. Meanwhile, the heroes, accompanied by loyal assistants and hidden fugitives, left the east. Soon they joined the knights who were heading to the Marquise's estate. Lydia was exhausted and looked forward to a quick rest as they were already close. However, as the girl dismounted her horse, she caught her foot on a stone and lost her balance. The heroine almost fell, but Randall was there in time to catch her, for which she was very grateful. The guy bowed silently and went about his business. Lydia stretched and realized that if Randall hadn't caught her, she could have been seriously injured. Arsène, who was standing nearby at that moment and watching the scene, clenched his hand into a fist and thought about how he wished he could have been in Milan's place to catch her himself. Then he suddenly froze, surprised by his own thoughts. Arsène noticed Lydia holding her back and remembered she had complained about the pain. At that moment, Byron's hand rested on his shoulder. The teacher smiled and advised Arsène not to secretly watch the girls. The guy tried to deny everything and reminded him that Lydia was not just a girl, but a priestess. Byron laughed, corrected himself, and this time advised him not to stare at the priestess. When Arsène tried to object again, the teacher noted that lying was also bad and left. No sooner had Byron recovered than he heard Lydia's voice behind him. She suggested he look around before entering the Marquis' estate. Arsène didn't object, but he didn't understand why the girl needed to do this. Then the heroine told him that she was going to cure her father with a certain medicine. Marquis Evans suffered from the white spirit disease, which caused him to experience corresponding hallucinations. For a long time, it was considered incurable, but in her past life, Lydia managed to get medicine in a labor camp. In fact, the source of the disease was narcotic poisoning from a medicinal herb widely used in the country. The heroine learned that toxins could be removed from the body with the help of dandelion roots. She gathered a whole bunch of flowers and made a rich decoction from them. Arson barely believed in treating the illness with such tea, but Lydia was determined. She carefully lifted her father's head from the pillow and gave him the healing concoction. In her past life, Lydia couldn't be with her father at the moment of his death because she was locked in a labor camp. But this time, the girl intended to fight to the end, and 10 days later, Marquis Evans finally opened his eyes. The first person he saw by his bed was his daughter. Lydia's eyes filled with tears, and she rushed to hug her father tightly when he spoke her name. Evans smiled, pressed his daughter's head to his chest, and asked why a grown lady was crying like a silly girl. Falling to her knees by his bed, Lydia told her father that Richard had ended their marriage to marry Giselle. And while Evans was trying to make sense of her words, the girl smiled subtly because now it was Richard's turn to feel what it meant to be used. In a tragic voice, she began to tell her father how her ex-fiancé had cheated on her with Giselle while they were engaged, and that Giselle was now pregnant. Evans was furious at how that arrogant brat dared to do such a thing to his daughter. In addition, he was interested in how Devon had behaved in that situation. And although everything inside the heroine was rejoicing, she again put on a sad face and said that her brother immediately recognized the annulment of the engagement. In addition, Devon accepted Giselle into the family as an adopted daughter, and Lydia refused, but she was threatened with imprisonment in the mansion. The butler was about to discreetly leave the room when the Marquis suddenly called out to him. He asked if his son had sent anyone to him about this matter. Learning that Devon hadn't done this since leaving the capital, Evans lost his temper as the situation was so serious and he hadn't informed him, and only Lydia cared for him. The Marquis ordered his son to be summoned immediately, but his daughter stopped him. She confessed that she hadn't wanted to say it and was afraid of shocking her father, but now she had finally decided to. And although Evans couldn't imagine what else could shock him more, Lydia told him that Devon had already prepared a coffin for his father in advance. A deathly silence hung in the room, and the heroine felt the gaze of her father and the butler upon her. After a minute, which seemed to last an eternity, Evans thanked his daughter for her frankness and decided to send someone to the capital to confirm it. Then he ordered the butler to make sure that the news of his recovery did not reach the capital. The heroine smiled imperceptibly because her father was obsessed with the idea of established pedigrees. He believed that only a son, in whom his blood flowed, could be his heir, and therefore he was eternally lenient with Devon. But Lydia had no doubt that this time her father would not let his son get away with it. Their relationship would sour, and that would be the beginning of her revenge. The heroine's days in Marquis Evans's castle passed peacefully, as if all past difficulties had never existed. On one such day, she went shopping with Maria to buy some baby clothes for the future child. On the way, they met Arson and Byron, who noticed how well the girls had bonded. Maria laughed and replied that they now had a club. But when Byron expressed interest, hoping to join, it turned out to be a club for those who are unlucky with men. Arson listened with a displeased look to the entry rule, according to which one had to swear never to fall in love. He thought about how foolish it was to promise himself not to date anyone instead of simply changing his taste in men. Lydia noticed Arson's intense gaze on her and asked if he wanted to tell her something. The young man was flustered and then informed her that the messenger from the Marquis had already returned to the capital. Upon learning this, the heroine immediately returned to the castle accompanied by Byron. On the way, he shared with her how surprised he was that Marquis Evans was already on his feet. Lydia admitted that she herself had not expected such a quick effect from the medicine. Then the girl smiled broadly and asked if he believed her now. Arson was silent, and then replied that he would not have saved her life if he hadn't believed her. Lydia's cheeks flushed, and then Byron admitted that he hadn't really believed her at first. But the heroine was still grateful to him, because without him she would have starved in the Marquis's domain, and now everything was going according to plan. They were already standing next to the door to Marquis Evans's study when they suddenly heard his enraged shout from inside. It turned out that besides the coffin, Devon had also paid the sculptor for a tombstone. When Lydia looked into the study, Her father was furious because his son had brought Giselle into the family without the head of the family's approval, and Evans intended to cancel everything. Seeing his daughter, he rushed to her and told her that all her words about those ungrateful scoundrels had turned out to be true. The Marquis was especially angry at Giselle, an orphan who was destined to be a servant, whom he had taken into his family, raised as a noblewoman, and she had stabbed him in the back. The butler agreed with him. Instead of caring for her benefactor, Giselle was aiming for Evan's daughter's place and was already one step away from becoming empress. Lydia had no doubt that the adoption process would now be interrupted. However, she couldn't allow the blame to fall solely on Giselle. Therefore, the girl hinted to her father that her cousin couldn't have made such a decision alone, and Richard clearly had a hand in it. The Marquis could no longer stand by and decided to immediately set off for the capital. Despite Lydia's attempts to stop her father from overdoing it, Evans was determined. Since his daughter had already healed him, he was going to personally fix everything, and he advised her to stay in the castle and rest until everything was resolved. Then, the heroine confessed to her father that she wanted to go to the border instead. Evans was very touched when his daughter announced that she had become a priestess and wanted to dedicate herself entirely to it. He, of course, had no idea that it was a lie, and stated that Lydia was admirable, unlike Devon, who couldn't learn anything from his sister. When the heroine left the Marquis's office, Arsène noted that everything had gone exactly as she wanted. Lydia informed him that as soon as her father arrived in the capital, the adoption process would be canceled. It was all over, and the papers she and Devon had signed no longer mattered. The girl was sure that even if the Emperor tried to persuade Evans, it wouldn't work. The Marquis helped Richard only so that his own daughter, Lydia, would become empress. But Richard turned a blind eye to this unspoken agreement. The feeling of betrayal and humiliation that the Marquis now felt was immense, and neither the Emperor's persuasions nor threats could sway him. According to Lydia, Richard is just a foolish boy to Evans, and no matter what he does, his father will have his own way. Arsène looked at the girl and noticed that not only did she look content, but the color of her face had also become much better since that day. And then he suddenly asked the heroine if she was going back to the capital and if she hadn't planned to stay at the castle. Lydia noticed that Arsène had become too agitated when asking that question. The girl looked him sternly in the eyes and asked if he really thought she would blab his secret to everyone. She decided that Arsène wanted her to stay, and he himself was vigilantly watching her. The heroine continued to pour out guesses and wouldn't let him get a word in, this time assuming that he didn't want her to go with him to the border. Lydia asked him not to worry that she would bother him, as she had no intention of setting foot in Edith's estate. When asked where she was going to stay there, the heroine said that she had learned from Cedric that there was a temple there. Arsène knew that there really was a temple there, but he also knew that this temple had not been used for more than 50 years. And when he informed Lydia that only ruins remained there, she replied that Byron would patch up the building. Arsène clutched his head, trying to re-evaluate all the girl's words, and she kept convincing him that she wouldn't cause him any problems. Lydia had simply never been to the border and didn't know how cold and dangerous it was there. The next day, when Marquis Evans departed for the capital, the heroes prepared to set off for the border. Lydia was about to mount her horse when Arsène approached and stopped her. He advised the girl to take a carriage this time, as the road to the border was dangerous. And although Lydia agreed, nothing dangerous happened on the way, even though the road was indeed difficult. The heroine decided that Arsène was probably warning about the monsters that inhabit the border. The border referred to 3 villages on the outskirts of the Marquisate lands, with infertile soil and long nights where monsters often appeared. From ancient times, Edith's family, vassals of the Evans, protected the border in exchange for exemption from taxes and military service. That's why Sir Arsène was assigned to these territories. And yet, they were still far away, and Lydia considered the chances of encountering monsters to be simply negligible. No sooner had the girl thought about this than the carriage shook violently, and she was thrown to the other corner. Shouts, warning of the monster's approach, were heard from outside, and the knights charged. Apparently, they say for a reason, that in life, what you least expect usually happens. The carriage overturned, and Lydia and Nella fell from their seats. The heroine reached the door, which was at the top, climbed out of the carriage, and then pulled Nella out as well. Suddenly, Maria's voice was heard, calling them to run to them as quickly as possible. The heroine was dragging Nella, who was unconscious and didn't see the monster behind her. When she turned around, she was gripped by a wild fear that she would have to die like this. The girl didn't know what to do. Her legs felt like cotton and wouldn't obey, and Lydia squeezed her eyes shut, ready to accept death. She hugged Nella tightly, and at that very moment, she heard a sharp sword cut through the air. When Lydia opened her eyes, she saw an agitated Arson in front of her. Tears welled up in the heroine's eyes, and both of them were covered in the blood of the wounded monster. Arson told everyone to step back, while he stayed behind to finish off the beast. Lydia, of course, knew that he was the best swordsman in the entire empire. But seeing everything firsthand, it became clear to her why Devon and Richard so desired Arson to be on their side. Maria was frightened when she saw so much blood on Lydia. The heroine calmed her down and explained that it was monster blood and none of them were hurt. Maria was glad that she was safe, but advised Lydia to wash up and change when everything settled down. An hour later, the heroine breathed a sigh of relief because she had finally washed all the blood off herself. They were lucky that there was a stream nearby, and Maria suggested returning there to wash their clothes at the same time. But when the girls got there, Lydia flushed with embarrassment because half-naked knights were bathing in the stream. Maria took the initiative and asked the men not to pay attention to them while they washed their clothes aside. However, the heroine squeezed her eyes shut and suggested to her friend that they do it a little later. Maria saw nothing shameful in this, as the knights were not completely undressed, and suggested to Lydia that they admire their beautiful uniforms. The heroine covered her eyes with her hands, claiming it was indecent, and at that moment, her gaze fell on Arsène. Her cheeks instantly flushed when she saw his smooth, muscular, perfect body. The girl didn't even notice that she had covered her friend's mouth, not her eyes. Finally, Lydia composed herself and told Maria that it was not good to joke like that in front of the priestess. However, her friend was sure that the goddess herself would have allowed her to take even a peek at what was right before her eyes. And just as Lydia agreed, Maria suddenly asked which of the guys, in her opinion, looked the best. And although the girls thought they were speaking quietly, in reality, all the knights heard them perfectly well. Although, to be more precise, they were listening intently, because when else would unmarried knights get to hear ladies praising them? None of them were going to miss such a moment, that's for sure. Therefore, each of the guys showed off to the priestess as best he could, demonstrating his muscles to her. And only Arsène silently watched what was happening and thought about what kind of nonsense everyone was busy with for some reason. However, when Lydia was already ready to express her opinion about the best body, he, like everyone else, turned to listen. Finally, the girl replied that, in her opinion, Sir Cedric's body looked the best. Maria supported her friend's choice as she felt exactly the same way. Cedric beamed with happiness that both girls had chosen him, and when the others tried to explain to the girls that physical strength was more important than looks, he advised them to be silently envious. Arsène, meanwhile, wondered if Lydia really liked such men and was simply attracted to muscles. He didn't understand why, in that case, she was staring at him specifically. However, the emperor never had such a body, which meant that tastes and love were completely different things. True love, in Arsène's opinion, meant winning someone's favor. When Viren caught himself thinking this, he didn't understand why he was thinking about it at all, and told himself to quickly get it out of his head. Nevertheless, no matter how hard Arsène tried, he couldn't stop thinking about it, and generally, when it came to Lydia, he was like a different person. After bathing, Byron went to the nanny's tent to inquire about her well-being. Luckily, Nella had only been slightly frightened, and she felt bad about delaying their departure. Arsène asked the nanny not to worry, as they still needed to fix the overturned carriage anyway, and it was decided to spend the night at the camp. Nella asked how Lydia was, since she had shielded her during the monster attack. The woman was deeply touched that even in such a situation, the girl had protected her with all her might, and she was very grateful. Sometimes it seemed to Nella that she owed Lydia everything, and Arsène agreed with her. The nanny advised the young man to keep a close eye on that girl. Arsène left the tent, deciding that now was the perfect time to dissuade Lydia from the idea of the temple and suggest she come with them to the estate. Since the girl had already faced danger, he assumed she would no longer be stubborn. However, as he approached Lydia, he hesitated, because at that moment she was talking about something with Cedric. Arsen listened and heard the knight informing the girl that it would be better for her to share a tent with the captain. He explained that this was the best option as the carriage was being repaired, it was dangerous to sleep outside, and it would be uncomfortable with the knights. Lydia didn't argue that this was quite logical. However, in her opinion, it was strange for an unmarried lady to share a tent with an unmarried man. Cedric threw up his hands, wondering if the lady was worried that the captain would do something indecent. But this didn't bother Lydia at all. She considered Sir Arsen reserved and was sure that he wouldn't get out of hand. Cedric laughed and replied that the captain was not reserved, but rather clueless. The knight froze when Arsen's voice sounded behind him, noting that he had talked too much. But Lydia could not be stopped, and she began to tease Arsen as clueless, no matter how much he denied it. Byron explained to her that clueless guys don't know how to talk to ladies, and he himself chose not to date anyone. And although it initially seemed to him that Lydia didn't believe him, she stated the opposite with a smirk. Moreover, after these words, she no longer felt awkward about having to share a tent with him. Arsen suggested that the heroine make herself comfortable inside, while he intended to stay outside. Lydia laughed, because for someone so clueless, he had rather good manners. The girl was curious why he remained single if he was so popular with ladies, and if it was connected to his secret. In part, she was right, because if he had a beloved, he would want to tell her everything. But Arsen did not want to place such a heavy burden on another person. To the question of why Lydia was so interested in his personal life, the girl replied that people usually get married at his age, but he was still not engaged. Arsen advised her to think more about her brother, because he wasn't married yet either. And suddenly, the heroine revealed that Devon also had a secret. She approached Arsen, whispered to him that the secret was that it was a secret, and laughed. The guy was once again convinced that Lydia really enjoyed teasing him. When the heroine finally stopped laughing, she still told Arsen that Devon hadn't actually gotten married because he couldn't. Before her death, their mother asked Lydia to fulfill one request. She told her daughter that when she grew up and got married, she should have at least 2 sons and give one to her brother. The thing was, Devon couldn't have children because he had problems with his male health. Mother cherished Devon more than anyone else and worried about him until her very last day. Lydia loved her mother very much, and that's why in her past life she kept this secret, just as her mother had asked. Now, however, she wasn't going to hide anything, and so she told Arsen that it happened because of the wrong medicine given to her brother in childhood. Byron didn't see a problem with this, as Devon could still be an heir. Of course, anyone could think that, except for their father, who insisted that someone of their blood continue the lineage. After a little thought, Arsen asked if all this would interfere with Lydia's plan. After all, the Marquis had only one son, and it was unlikely he was ready to disown him. The heroine agreed with this, but she was sure that even this could be circumvented. But she wasn't going to tell him that, no matter how much he asked her. Arsen replied that he wasn't too interested in that, and instead suggested discussing whether Lydia was really going to live in the temple. At the border, monsters, scarier and larger than the one they had seen during the day, often visited the villages. To finally convince the girl, Arsen explained that people usually freeze in fear just by seeing them. Lydia was deep in thought, and he hoped she finally understood how dangerous this was. However, before Arsen could offer Lydia to stay at Edith's estate, she suddenly declared that in that case, she would have to learn the art of swordsmanship. He had not expected to hear such a solution to the problem from her. And when Lydia repeated once again that she wasn't going to be a burden to him, Arsen realized that convincing her wouldn't be so easy. He suggested the girl stop talking nonsense and go to bed as soon as possible, so they could set off at dawn. And although Lydia was indignant, wondering who goes to bed at such an hour, a minute later, Arsen was already watching her sleep. He sat down on the neighboring bed and thought about how difficult the past few days had been. Lydia poisoned herself, climbed off the balcony to escape from home, snuck into a labor camp, and was then attacked by a monster. Suddenly, the heroine began to toss and moan in her sleep, and Arsen approached her bed. Judging by the girl's furrowed brow, she was having some kind of nightmare. Lydia was sitting on the bare, cold floor of an underground dungeon. On the other side of the bars stood Richard, promising the girl he wouldn't kill her. He explained to her that an attempt on the future empress and the heir in her womb was a serious crime. But since Lydia, being his fiancée, saved him, a mere prince now, having become emperor, he decided to spare her life. Richard expected exemplary behavior from the girl, as he had saved her from execution only once and was not going to show her mercy again. When the emperor turned to leave, Lydia reached out a trembling hand to him and began to beg him not to go. She admitted her mistake and asked him to stay with her a little longer because she was very scared. But this was a different Lydia, the one she had been before in a past life. And now it was as if she was looking at herself from the outside. That scoundrel didn't even turn around, as if it was too much trouble for him to even look at the girl. The new Lydia smirked. She, like him, had no intention of killing him either. Instead, the heroine was determined to make his life hell. Arsène stood by Lydia's bed and heard her begging Richard not to leave. She said she hated the emperor, but her heart was obviously still drawn to him. But Arsène himself, for some reason, felt a strange and unpleasant sensation at this thought. He didn't understand what it was because whatever Lydia felt for the emperor, it shouldn't have concerned him. And yet, for some reason, first in the hollow and now again next to her, Arsène felt something inexplicable. The next morning, Devon was informed that his father was already approaching their capital residence. The servant reported that Marquis Evans had recently crossed the outer walls of the capital. Devon hadn't even had time to find out the details about the White Spirit's illness when he heard the rustle of wheels. He ordered his servant to immediately get rid of the coffin, and he himself rushed to meet the Marquis, who was already getting out of the carriage. With a wide smile on his face, Devon rushed into the courtyard, trying with all his might to show how happy he was about his father's recovery. But Evans was clearly not in the mood for joyful embraces. He frowned at his son and asked if it was true that he intended to adopt Giselle into their family. Devon was initially tense, then suggested to his father that they continue their conversation inside. As they entered the house, he was relieved to notice that the coffin had already been removed. Devon asked the butler if his father was truly well, as he didn't look good. The butler replied that the Marquis was simply tired from his journey, and there was no cause for concern. However, Evans himself was concerned about something completely different, and he once again asked his son if he was really going to adopt Giselle. When Devon looked away and admitted it, the Marquis gnashed his teeth in anger. He accused his son of completely losing his pride if instead of fighting, he sided with the instigator when she took his sister's place. In his defense, Devon stated that Lydia herself said she wouldn't be happy if she married without love. Evans could hardly believe that his son accepted the breakup for his sister's happiness. But Devon replied that it was partly true, and besides, the emperor had promised him something. According to him, Richard promised to grant Marquis Evans the title of Duke. However, the father grabbed a pillow from the bed and threw it at Devon, who still didn't understand what exactly he disliked. Evans was furious with his son, whose greed could ruin their entire family. Meanwhile, after 2 days of travel, the heroes finally reached the borderlands. Lydia looked around, not understanding why the villages were in such decline, as these lands had not seen fighting during the coup. Cedric noticed the girl's surprise and approached her to try and clarify things. He explained that half of the knightly order was busy with a rebellion, so there weren't enough people to fight the monsters. However, Cedric had no doubt that now that the captain was back, everything would be fine. It was now clear to Lydia that Sir Arsène was the pillar of the borderlands. The heroine noticed Nella and Byron hugging some people, and tears of happiness streaming down their cheeks. She was sure that now, no matter what happened, they would live safely under Arsène's protection. One of Lydia's goals in this life was definitely accomplished. The heroine asked Cedric where the temple was. As it turned out, she was indeed going to live there. The knight looked around, noticed Randall, and asked him to escort the lady. When Lydia arrived, she was extremely unpleasantly surprised. She knew, of course, that the temple was neglected, but she couldn't even imagine how much. Obviously, no one had been there for a long time, as the doors were tightly locked. Randall asked the girl to step aside and pulled the handle himself. But since the lock wouldn't yield, the guys simply broke down the temple door. Lydia smiled, thanked Randall, but he silently turned and left, leaving her on the doorstep. A week later, Cedric arrived at Arsène's office and reported that some strangers were roaming the village streets. And although they claimed to be mercenaries, it seemed that these people, who constantly asked about the captain, had been sent by the emperor. Arsène ordered to leave them for now, as they wouldn't be able to find out anything anyway. Something else was bothering him, as he hadn't left his office for a week and was worried about Lydia. And although Cedric hadn't heard these strangers talking to Lady Evans, he decided to send Randall there just in case. And although Arsène didn't understand why he decided to send the very person Lydia didn't get along with, Raymond stated that it was in the past. According to him, Randall and Lydia became close, and he even helps her with the temple's repairs. This greatly surprised the captain, as he knew perfectly well that Malin didn't even believe in gods. Arsène jumped out of his chair and, putting on his jacket as he went, hurried to the temple. Lydia was very surprised when she met him in the courtyard. She decided that he had come to meet Byron and informed him that he was not there. Arsène replied that he had just come to look around and noted that the temple looked much better. The heroine said that many people had helped them, and she especially singled out Sir Randall, who both repaired and cleaned and generally turned out to be a jack of all trades. But when Arsène replied that he had heard about it, Lydia decided that he was deliberately pretending. Because when she thanked Randall for his help, he said that the captain had ordered him to help her. From all this, the girl concluded that Arsène was simply too shy to talk about it. Apparently, Sir Cedric was right when he called the captain completely clueless. Lydia laughed, but not wanting to embarrass Arsène even more, she made a request to him. She had heard about a lily-of-the-valley glade in the forest and wanted to gather them to plant near the temple. Since it was dangerous for her to go there alone, Arsène declared that he would go with her. No matter how Lydia tried to dissuade him, as she was sure he had many other things to do, he still insisted. And although she claimed she could go there later with Byron, Arsène knew perfectly well that she would go there alone. And while the heroine was trying to figure out how he knew that, Byron offered her his hand. There were slippery stones in the forest, and she could slip, so he advised Lydia to be careful. The girl allowed him to help her, and they continued walking hand in hand. When the heroes reached the place, Lydia was delighted by the number of snow-white flowers that covered the entire glade. But at some point, she suddenly returned to Arsène and, with horror in her eyes, announced that there was a monster in the bushes. The guy turned towards the monster, but for some reason, his gaze remained completely calm. He explained to Lydia that it was not a monster at all, but a winter rabbit. And then the girl suddenly realized that it was with this terrible beast that Arsène had compared her at the beginning of their acquaintance. And although he tried to justify himself, claiming that she looked like those rabbits in winter when they grow fur and become fluffy, Lydia clung to him with a death grip. Then she snorted, crossed her arms over her chest, pouted, and indignantly turned away from Arsène. When silence fell, Byron remembered the purpose of his visit. He asked Lydia if any mercenaries had been looking for her by chance, and it turned out that they had indeed visited her recently. Arsène told the girl that these were the Emperor's spies and promised to drive them out soon, but still advised her to be on her guard. The heroine became curious how he intended to do this, as these people might suspect that he was hiding something in these lands. And if so, then next time Richard could send people openly, and if any of them remembered the servants of the Byron house, it could create problems. Therefore, Lydia suggested that Arsène make the spies leave of their own free will. All they had to do was stage a drama between the two of them. Of course, because of this plan, they risked facing consequences later on. Nevertheless, Lydia suggested pretending that she was chasing Arsène and he wasn't interested in her. And although Byron was literally speechless at such a proposal, the heroine was confident in the success of this plan. She had no doubt that as soon as the spies found out about this, they would immediately rush to report the news to the Emperor. Lydia planned to behave as she had before with Richard, because he himself had spoken of her talent for scaring men away, and although, in Arsène's opinion, the Emperor might have dragged the girl to the capital to nip everything in the bud, she was sure of the opposite. Because in that case, rumors might start to spread that Richard still harbored feelings for his ex-fiancée, and since he ascended the throne as a result of a coup d'état, his position was precarious. Moreover, he had already tarnished his reputation when he broke off his engagement with Lydia. Richard needed the support of society and the people, and therefore the heroine was sure that he would not want all this gossip. Lydia considered her plan quite good, and Arson finally agreed. He leaned towards her and asked to keep this idea just between them. And besides, in Arson's opinion, if Lydia was going to do something, she needed to do it smartly. The heroine promised to visit his estate so often that she would wear out his doorstep. Then she laughed and advised Arson to be careful, and he replied that it would be simpler if she just stayed with him right away. The heroine didn't understand why he was so persistently trying to drag her to his place. According to the girl, someone might have thought he was courting her. And although Arson insisted that wasn't the case, she laughingly replied that she knew, and it was because he was simply clueless. Lydia noticed another clearing with flowers and hurried there. Arson watched her go, thinking that he completely didn't understand the Emperor. He didn't understand what Lydia did to annoy Richard so much that he constantly whined about how tired he was. In Arson's opinion, this girl was incredibly cute when she pestered and teased someone. In reality, he didn't necessarily have to tell Lydia that she should do something wisely. And anyway, he could have not come up with any plan in the first place, but he didn't want to refuse, because he actually didn't mind spending time with her at all. When they returned to the temple, Lydia thanked Arson for escorting her, but at the same time, she told him not to be nice to her from now on, because according to the plan, she was supposed to be chasing him. Arson blushed and replied that he wasn't chasing her, but just looking after her. And still, Lydia asked him to assist her for the sake of their common goal. When the heroine got Arson's promise, she remembered something else and thanked him for sending Sir Randall to her. And although Byron didn't understand what she was talking about, Lydia laughingly stated that she knew he had told him to help her with the repairs. The girl found it very typical to hide his intentions due to embarrassment, and yet she wanted to thank him. Arson could still object, say that he hadn't given such an order, or that Randall had lied, but for some reason, he didn't want to. When Byron was returning home, it was already getting dark, and he had told Cedric that he wouldn't be at the temple for long. The thought that he would now have to pretend to push Lydia away kept bothering him. And Lydia, meanwhile, was thinking that she would now have to pretend that she wasn't indifferent to Arson, and they both wondered if they would really succeed. The debutante ball fell on the day of Lydia's mother's death. She constantly thought about her and couldn't calmly socialize with others. At some point, the girl couldn't take it anymore and ran out into the yard, where she bumped into Richard. He asked Lady Evans why she wasn't at the ball. The heroine burst into tears and confessed that she missed her mother very much. Then Richard offered her his handkerchief, said it was okay to cry, and that he understood her feelings. He admitted that sometimes he himself missed his late mother very much. Apparently, it was at that moment that Lydia's heart first reached out to Richard. From that day on, Lady Evans was a frequent guest at the Third Prince's Palace, and the servants began to spread rumors about them. Then came the engagement, then the betrayal, the breaking of the engagement, and finally, the imprisonment. But Lydia didn't really want to remember such things, and she pushed those thoughts away. Nevertheless, she was about to do something similar again, but this time for revenge. Lydia firmly decided to stage a performance the very next day and flirt with Arsène in front of everyone. However, the next day, as the heroine was walking through the square, she noticed some commotion there. She learned from Arsène that the County of Vond had deceived them again. When Lydia found out that the county was selling grain to these lands 10 times more expensively, she decided to deal with it quickly. But the problem was that bringing provisions to the border was not easy, as monsters immediately smelled the grain. They could have bought seeds to grow something themselves, but merchants refused to sell them any. It turned out that they were inflating prices, as they knew that the border residents had no choice. When asked if the Count knew about this, Lydia couldn't answer precisely, as he was always in the capital, but the land manager definitely knew about it. This information surprised the heroine, as she had never met the Count in the capital. If he didn't attend the same events as Lydia, then he didn't have much power. And if he was lower in status than the Marquis, then it was time for not the priestess, but Lady Evans of the Marquisate to make her entrance. So Lydia loudly asked who was ready to stir up some trouble in Wand County with her. Just a few days later, the heroine was sitting in a carriage with Arsène. She admitted with a smile that she hadn't even imagined that he would be the one traveling with her. Despite the fact that Lydia was accompanied by knights, Arsène was afraid that nothing would happen to her. He was sure that the girl would be safest with him. Arson tired her with his talk about the county having poor security, that merchant ships constantly docked there, mercenaries swarmed around, and robberies happened at every turn. Lydia knew that Sir Randall also really wanted to go, and regretted that he couldn't. A week before that, when the heroine asked who wanted to stir up trouble in the county with her, Milan, along with the others, raised his hand. The girl was thrilled by how enthusiastic everyone was about her suggestion. However, Arsène was against leaving the border unguarded, so he announced that not everyone would go. He pointed to Cedric and 3 other knights whom he intended to take with him, but Randall was not among them. Later, in the carriage, Arsène realized that he shouldn't have chosen the escorts personally. He could only hope that Randall hadn't noticed it, especially since it happened in front of his subordinates. Lydia distracted Arsène from his thoughts when she asked him about the list he had mentioned. Bayern had everything ready, and he handed the girl a scroll. The list was incredibly long, and when Lydia noticed it, Arsène turned away, feeling awkward. Without looking her in the eyes, he explained that the monster attack had caused enough damage which made the list grow. However, Lydia didn't see a problem with this, as she was sure they would have enough finances. With these words, she unfolded the pouch and showed Arsène the diamonds hidden inside. With a cunning smile, the girl declared that it was too early to be surprised, and that wasn't all. Before Arsène could recover, she pulled out her underwear from the travel bag and showed it to him. She explained that she had sewn her father's emergency supplies into it to smuggle them out unnoticed by Devon. The diamonds might not be enough, so they had to get everything. When Lydia admitted she was a little tired because she had to stay up late ripping seams the night before, Arsène, hiding his face in shame, told her to hand him the laundry so he could do it himself. The heroine hesitated, but he convinced her that she needed some sleep to have the strength to stir up trouble in the county. Finally, the girl agreed to take a nap, thanked Arsène, and jokingly added that she wouldn't worry if some of her underwear suddenly went missing. Within a few minutes, Lydia fell asleep, settling into the seat. Arsène clutched his head, amazed at what he was even doing. When the heroes reached the county of Vande, Lydia was astonished. They had only crossed the river, but the standard of living there was completely different. There were inns, shops, and restaurants everywhere. The territories, though small, were luxurious, and it seemed strange to the girl that she had never heard of the Count before. But there was no time to think about it now, and Lydia proceeded with what she had come here for. For the next week, she was to return in the guise of the well-known spoiled and selfish Lady Evans. According to the plan, the heroine was supposed to spend a lot of money so that everyone would think she was still under the Marquis's care. Lydia was supposed to pretend to be a fool so that they would fleece her for as much money as possible. And as soon as the land manager heard about her, she was to cause a big scandal and send him away. And since Sir Arsène also went to the county with her, they could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Lydia decided to drag him around everywhere as her bodyguard, as if she were completely foolish, so that rumors would spread that she was fond of him. And the heroine began to implement her plan, starting with the most luxurious clothing boutique in the county. She grabbed Arsène by his tie and told him to pretend he was being dragged against his will. According to Lydia, no matter what she did, he had to act as if he didn't want it. And if he couldn't manage that at all, the girl advised Arsène to simply maintain a poker face. However, when the heroes entered the boutique, they encountered a problem, as the consultant informed them that they do not sew robes for priestesses. Cedric explained to the woman that this lady was the daughter of Marquis Evans. It was obvious that rumors about Lydia Evans becoming a priestess and leaving for the borderlands had already spread throughout the empire. The heroine gathered her thoughts and, with a face ready for a scandal, asked if the atelier didn't do custom orders. The consultant immediately changed her attitude and rushed to the client, claiming that since a priestess had graced them with her presence, they would do anything for her. Lydia capriciously announced that the temple had only provided her with 1 outfit, but she needed at least 3. A moment later, she was presented with a variety of fabrics to choose from. But Lydia continued to act like a spoiled girl and criticized every fabric offered. The consultant stood aside, trembling and not knowing how to please her. Finally, Lydia chose a suitable fabric for herself, the most expensive one in the store, imported from abroad. The consultant suggested adding lace to the sleeves and pleats to the neckline, but the girl discontentedly stated that she didn't want to look too pretentious. Then, she ordered pearls to be added to the collar to make it look neater. Everyone started praising her for her attention to detail and showering her with compliments. When asked if they would be finished in a week, the consultant promised to complete it as quickly as possible. And suddenly, she asked Lydia why her maid wasn't with her, as usually assistants handle such things. Lydia angrily looked at the consultant and indignantly asked why a priestess would need to bring a maid with her. The woman was flustered and hesitated, not knowing what to answer. After all, if you look at it from another perspective, priestesses don't sew pearls onto their collars. Arsène was impressed. Lydia really did look like a spoiled girl who had been forced to become a priestess. By that time, the consultant had finally composed herself and apologized to Lady Evans. The heroine called out to Sir Arsène and motioned for him to pay. The consultant's mouth dropped open in surprise when a real diamond appeared in her hands. And when she asked again if the lady was really going to pay for 3 dresses with diamonds, Lydia, with feigned displeasure, asked if there could be any problems with that. It was a perfect hit, because after such an overpayment, everyone would know by the next day that an easy target had appeared in the county. As expected, the next day, every merchant was hunting for Lydia. The only problem was that the heroine was incredibly tired of wandering through shops. There were a lot of people around, and the girl decided it was time to start her game. With tears in her eyes, she collapsed right onto the ground and began to complain about how tired her legs were. Lydia pitifully turned to Sir Arsène and asked him to carry her in his arms. The girl assumed that he would, of course, get all huffy and refuse her. However, contrary to her expectations, before Lydia could even realize what was happening, she found herself in Arsène's arms. His gaze showed strong anxiety as he looked into the girl's eyes and asked if she was really that tired. The heroine's thoughts were muddled from the shock she experienced, because everything had gone completely wrong. Arsène silently carried the girl to her room, then asked her to get some good rest and wished her all the best. Lydia was initially taken aback, and then she rushed after him and grabbed his arm. The heroine pinned the captain against the wall and started scolding him. She explained that she was just trying to follow the plan and pretend to be hitting on him, and for some reason he immediately picked her up. Arsène, bewildered, admitted that he thought it wasn't a game at all because Lydia's face was very pale. But in the girl's opinion, that didn't matter at all, and he should have pushed her away no matter what. And yet, Arsène worried that she might have actually been hurt, as it was hard to tell if she was playing or not. Lydia insisted that if she were truly hurt, they could simply call a healer. Arsène grabbed her hand and asked what if something happened to her in the meantime. The heroine turned away from him, pulled her hand back, and then suggested they come up with a special signal for such cases. After a little thought, the girl suggested using a wink to make it seem even more like she was seducing him. From then on, as soon as she winked, Arsène would have to push her away. And although it definitely looked like seduction, Byron found this signal inappropriate. But when Lydia asked what was wrong with the wink, he suddenly blushed. Finally, Arsène, without looking the girl in the eyes, admitted that when she did that, he absolutely didn't want to push her away. Nothing else should have been expected from him because it was too sweet a signal to act rudely after it. Looking at Lydia's surprised face, Arsène laughed because she, as he had thought, was still very much like a rabbit. Looking at his smile, the heroine suddenly thought of something she had never noticed before. Arsène's face was usually always gloomy, but now, when he laughed, he looked like a boy. However, this strange feeling in her chest quickly turned to indignation when Lydia remembered what that rabbit looked like. Deciding that he was making fun of her, the girl started swearing and waving her hands. Her pride was somehow hurt by the fact that this reserved guy suddenly teased her. She pushed him out of her room and, as a final thought, advised him to remember that, one way or another, the signal would be a wink. When the girl slammed the door shut behind him, for some reason, his words kept replaying in her mind. But Lydia tried to convince herself that the captain wasn't trying to say she was cute, but rather compared her to a scary winter rabbit. Well, the first attempt failed, but if they worked well together from now on, everything planned should work out. Unfortunately, Lydia had no idea that her plan was doomed from the start, because that very evening at dinner, the knights were discussing the day's events. Before, their captain hadn't even looked at the lady, and the men were sure that if people from the capital had seen this, they would surely have fainted, because he carried her as if she were a precious jewel. And although the knights believed that Lady Evans needed to understand Arsène's feelings as soon as possible, in Cedric's opinion, it wasn't that simple. He was sure that the captain himself didn't realize what he was feeling, so his friends decided to give him a push. The delegation had been on the Count's territory for 3 days already. Rumors must have spread by now, and Lydia decided it was time to go to the merchant for grain. She told everyone to stick to the plan and not to stop her, no matter what she did. The heroine came to the market and asked the merchant the price of potatoes. The man replied that he usually asked for 10 nan in gold for a box, but for the lady, he would let it go for 8. But Lydia remembered perfectly well that the price for a box should have been 20 nan in silver, so she asked the seller if he wasn't asking too much. The man threw up his hands, claiming that the lady wouldn't be able to find it cheaper anyway. When the girl asked the same question to the merchant in the neighboring shop, he confirmed his words. The man began to convince Lady Evans that the seller was an honest guy and never overcharged. The heroine waited a minute, then threw the potato on the ground and began her performance. The girl screamed and was indignant that she was being taken for a fool who didn't even know the prices of potatoes. The seller continued to make excuses, claiming that he was telling the truth and that prices in the county were higher than in the capital. But Lydia was unstoppable. She overturned his drawers and screamed that he dared to mock the daughter of Marquis Evans himself. Finally, she exclaimed that she still didn't want to eat their disgusting grain and would rather grow it herself. Then Lydia called an assistant and ordered him to buy all the seedlings. The young man lowered his head and regretfully informed Lady Evans that the merchants refused to sell them the seedlings. Hearing this, Lydia screams that these people obviously wanted her to starve to death. Her entire company watched with interest the magnificent performance that the heroine put on. And when the situation escalated to the limit Lydia desired, she ordered Count Vonda to be summoned to her immediately. Rumors of the incident at the market quickly spread throughout the county, and upon hearing the news, the Count's representative immediately sent Lady Evans a letter inviting her to his estate. But Lydia, in anger, tore up the letter, declaring that the Count should come to her and not the other way around. The girl threw the scraps of paper in the messenger's face, turned around, and hurried to her room. And since everyone was just gathered, she decided to try to implement her plan again. Lydia turned to Arsène, winked at him, and complained about pain in her legs and arms, because of which, she said, she would hardly be able to fall asleep. And although the heroine expected everyone to understand what she had in mind, everything went wrong again. The knights began to say in unison that she had overexerted herself while pushing boxes at the market, and offered to leave such work to them from now on. Cedric picked up on their words and advised the captain to give the lady a massage. The heroine was shocked by how incorrectly the knights had interpreted her words, and she was missing it when suddenly Arsène himself declared that it sounded quite reasonable. He easily picked Lydia up in his arms and offered to carry her to her room in that case. The girl looked at him in shock and whispered, asking what he was doing and if he hadn't seen her signal. Convinced that Arsène had seen everything perfectly, she reminded him exactly how he should have behaved after her wink. Lydia genuinely didn't understand how he could just agree to all of it, and when asked if he was also going to give her a massage, Arsène answered in the affirmative. And then Byron suddenly added that this was exactly why he had come, completely confusing the girl. When they entered the room, Arsène sat Lydia on the bed, suggested she lie down and stretch out her legs, and then rolled up his sleeves. The girl couldn't believe he was actually going to give her a massage, and not even of her hands, but specifically her feet. Arsène insisted that her muscles were overstrained from anxiety, and this would help relax them. Lydia completely didn't understand what was happening. Earlier, this same person had scolded her for wearing pajamas, and now suddenly he was going to give her a massage. Arsène, in a stern voice, told her not to think about strange things. Stating that she hadn't been thinking of anything of the sort, the heroine stretched her legs out on the bed. With her whole demeanor, she tried to show that she was absolutely calm and nothing unusual was happening. Finally, Arsène began to slowly massage the girl's legs. For a while, she lay silently, and then discontentedly declared that if he continued to massage them with such force for even a whole day, her muscles wouldn't relax. According to Arsène, her legs weren't like Milan's and Cedric's. They were too thin, and he was afraid of breaking them. Nevertheless, he promised to apply more force and asked her to tell him if it hurt. Now it was a perfect massage, and Lydia asked Arsène to keep up the good work. Byron continued, and then suddenly asked the girl not to use pain as an excuse anymore, because he couldn't distinguish pretense from real pain. Lydia got angry and reminded him about the signal they had agreed upon earlier. And despite the fact that the heroine had already prepared several similar operations, Arsène suggested she prepare new ones in that case. The girl pouted indignantly, because she was the one who had to plan everything, and according to her, it was impossible to even talk to him. This remark surprised Byron, as it seemed to him that they communicated perfectly. Stating that this was why it was so difficult, Lydia turned away. She lay there, wondering how she could play the seductress if she could no longer pretend to be hurt. Perhaps she could invite him for tea, or beg him to go on a picnic together. Perhaps physical contact could also work, because then he would surely push her away. When Lydia's legs relaxed, Arsène offered to massage her hands. But the girl didn't answer, and only then did he notice that she had fallen asleep. Arsène sat down next to her on the bed and wondered if Lydia had relaxed too much, being in the same room with a man. Although, perhaps, it was he who was not cautious enough. Going together to pick flowers, giving her a massage, and staying by her side under the guise of supervision. At some point, Arsène began to think that the reason was elsewhere, and it wasn't that succumbing to her influence was unpleasant, but he wasn't sure if it was permissible. Given his secret, danger could arise at any moment, and Byron doubted he could afford such a luxury. He understood his position and had no intention of crossing the line. As he covered Lydia with the blanket, Arsène suddenly realized that, ironically, he didn't want to stop. The next day, Lady Evans was visited by Count Vonda's representative, Ruzan David. He agreed to give the priestess anything she desired, and all she had to do was say what exactly she wanted. Lydia, with a smirk, asked if he was ready to fulfill her wish, even if she wanted his head. Ruzan David always considered himself lucky, because being a simple nobleman without a title or lands, he was able to become the man who controlled the count's territories. That's why he was sure that he could calm the young lady down, by persuading her a little, after which she would turn her anger into mercy. But when Lydia asked him such a question, David's confidence instantly vanished. The girl suggested that he, apparently, considered her a fool, since he decided to flatter her so that she would calm down and then quietly leave. David began to claim the opposite, and stated that the day before, he had gathered all the scoundrel merchants and given them a good dressing down. And to apologize, he allegedly planned to cover the costs of the pier and the boat trip. But Lydia believed that summoning the merchants, saying a few words, and offering a bribe could hardly be called giving them a good dressing down. David was confused, not understanding how this girl knew everything. Lydia asked the man if he didn't know that these merchants were selling grain at absurdly high prices, and not just in the border regions. And the dock fees, for some reason, were only higher when traveling to the border. David continued to insist, frightened, that he knew nothing and promised to severely punish all those responsible. From his words, Lydia concluded that he was a trusted person who knew nothing, with words that because of this she would probably have to personally meet with the Count. The girl stood up from her seat, and although David tried to stop her by saying that the Count was currently in the capital, she declared that in that case she would go there. And since she was going to the capital anyway, she declared her intention to talk to her father about the county making illegal profits through fraud. David knew that Marquise Evans and Arsène Edith had helped the emperor ascend to the throne, and if the information reached the ruler, the blame would fall not only on the count, but the representative would also lose his head. So he fell to his knees before Lydia and begged her to quell her anger. He promised to immediately behead all those merchants and their families. However, contrary to his expectations, the girl called it disgusting and said she didn't need anyone's heads. Then, one of Lydia's knights intervened and explained that the young lady wished to fulfill her duties as a priestess. She wanted to show mercy to the people of the borderlands, but the merchants did not understand her intentions, and this upset her greatly. And to please the priestess, Lord Ruzan only needed to follow her plan. David rushed to Lydia, saying that he had been a fool and had failed to grasp her boundless kindness. He asked her to forgive his foolishness and give him a chance to atone. David promised to donate all the potatoes he wanted to buy to the temple as an offering. Lydia also reminded him that merchants refused to sell seeds and seedlings in the borderlands. And then Rujan promised to make all of them, without exception, sell everything that was required of them. And when Cedric noted that the young priestess had poor health and there were no herbalists in the borderlands, David promised to contact them as well. And since tools were needed for farming, he was going to deliver the message to the blacksmiths as well. The heroine was quite pleased and thanked Mr. Rujan. However, when she added that as a token of his sincerity she would accept his gifts, the man froze in horror. Lydia clarified that, of course, she was talking about the mooring fee, the cost of the boat trip, and everything the servant was carrying outside. As they saw Rujan off, the knights advised him to be careful on his way back. Turning around one last time, he clarified once more if the priestess was truly not going to the capital. And when Arsène replied that no one could know for sure, David began tearfully begging him to put in a good word for him. Promising once again to arrange for the priestess to be able to buy whatever she wished, Rujan departed. When he left, Arsène asked his assistant what major purchase was being discussed. He replied that, although Lydia herself wasn't planning to buy anything, he thought it would be nice to buy a new carriage and horse for her. The next morning, the heroine went to the market and approached the fish stall. However, when she asked the fishmonger about the price, the woman, who David had already warned, asked the priestess to accept her goods as an offering to the goddess. The heroine understood that Rujan had put a lot of pressure on everyone because each of the sellers said that everything was free. But after Lydia left the borderlands, people would still have to trade with the county, and she needed to instill fear, not destroy relationships. Therefore, the girl replied that she would pay, because otherwise, these lands would no longer be able to do business with each other. And, among other things, Lydia, who had been given a chance to live a second life, wanted to give others the opportunity to change as well. In response to the merchant's surprise, she stated that she understood the desire for easy profit, but she agreed to give them a chance, hoping that such foolishness would not be repeated. With these words, the girl poured a handful of coins into the merchant's palm, and the merchant, pressing her hand to her chest, thanked the priestess. However, Lydia added in conclusion that if this happened again, she would no longer let them get away with it. Soon, the delegation from the borderlands gathered enough provisions to ensure that people would not starve this year. Arsène asked the young lady if she wished to buy anything else. Lydia replied in the affirmative, but warned that the item was quite large. Arsène clarified if she meant a cart or a carriage, but his guess turned out to be incorrect. Lydia stated that what she wanted was in that direction and pointed to the left. The knights, led by the captain, looked around, and genuine surprise appeared on their faces. In that direction was the forge, and Arsène assumed she wanted agricultural tools or a sword. However, it turned out that Lydia wanted the entire forge itself. The girl knew there was a forge on the border, but in her opinion, it was too small to develop a mine. Grandfather Robert inspected the borderlands and confirmed that there could indeed be magic stones there. If word got out, everyone would flock to the border, and it would be difficult for Arsène to maintain control there. But purchasing equipment for mine development could accelerate the spread of rumors, and everything needed to be resolved secretly within the border area. When asked why she needed a forge, Lydia asked them to consider it a woman's dream, because everyone dreams of having one. And although none of her companions understood who could even dream of such a thing, the heroine declared that she would lie on the ground and cry if they didn't let her buy the forge. Arsène gave in and told his assistant to go to the owner. And while the knights were busy buying the forge, the heroine went into a cafe to rest. She liked the place, with its pleasant atmosphere and delicious desserts, but Arsène, who was sitting opposite her, kept looking around for some reason, and the girl decided that he was bored with her. In reality, Byron was just surveying the area, but he simply stated dryly that it wasn't true. Since that was the case, Lydia suggested he feed her some cake and playfully winked. Last time, Arsène told her not to pretend to be sick anymore, so the girl decided to act spoiled. And although she expected him to pretend that he didn't like it at all, the guy reached for a fork and asked if strawberry cake would do. The heroine gritted her teeth and asked why he was acting this way. Arson came to his senses, asked for a second chance, and Lydia repeated her request. After a few seconds of silence, the guy forced out a dry refusal. Lydia was shocked by how he did it, so she suggested he try again. Looking her straight in the eye, Arson stated that he was against it, that it was problematic, and asked her to stop. And then the heroine realized they had big problems, because Byron was playing so badly that they probably couldn't even fool a dead dog. But judging by his face, he didn't even realize what the problem was. The heroine decided to change tactics and suggested that from the moment she gave the signal, he should frown slightly, freeze for a couple of seconds, and then order someone else to do it. And if there's no one around, then do it himself, frowning and pretending as if he's being forced. Arson speared a piece of cake with his fork, frowned, and offered it to Lydia. The girl ate the cake, but she still felt like something was wrong. At that moment, Arson looked more like someone who simply hated cakes. The heroine sadly thought that with such an approach, it would not be easy to deceive the Emperor's spies. And while she was pondering another plan, which she thought was quite good, Arson suddenly reached out and touched her cheek. The girl froze for a moment, but he explained that she had cream on her face. And suddenly, a realization dawned on Lydia, because before, she thought Arson understood nothing. But, just like last time, everything worked out too well for him. His behavior with women was so natural, as if he were talking to a knight. From all this, the heroine concluded that Arson saw her as a comrade. She once again convinced herself that he had no reason to see her as a woman. Apparently, a friendly bond had formed between them, and this thought pleased Lydia, as she had never had companions before. She even thought that if all went well, they might even become friends. Seeing how Lydia's expression changed, Arson asked what she was thinking about. He froze when she, with a smirk, replied that she might have been thinking about their future. Blood rushed to Arson's face, and he asked her to clarify what exactly she meant. But at that moment, their conversation was interrupted by a street vendor approaching their table. He offered them an aromatic candle, with which the couple could spend a very passionate night. Lydia froze because the merchant's voice seemed very familiar to her for some reason. Suddenly, a memory surfaced before her eyes, in which she stood over the bodies of Nella and Byron. The man was crying and asking for her forgiveness because, as a healer, he couldn't save them. Lydia jumped to her feet and asked Arson to catch that guy as soon as possible. The merchant was delighted when he saw a couple already heading towards him to buy a candle. However, before he could react, Arson had already twisted him and pinned him to the floor. Lydia approached the man and, calling him by name, asked him not to worry and said that she would like to talk to him. Wellington Byrne was once a successful council member in the capital, but was eventually exiled to a labor camp when he sold illegal drugs to pay off gambling debts. He arrived about 2.5 years after Lydia, and thanks to him, the heroine was able to hear news from the outside. The girl planned to deal with him after she sorted out her main tasks, but she accidentally ran into him at this cafe. Perhaps outside he was a gambler and a drug dealer, but in the labor camp, he was the only healer. When an epidemic swept through the empire, claiming countless lives, he walked through that hell, trying to save at least one more person. In the end, Byrne died caring for patients until his last breath, so Lydia wanted to give him a chance to live a new life. The knights were surprised when the captain and Lady Evans returned, and they weren't alone. Lydia introduced Wellington Byrne to everyone as her acquaintance, a healer. She asked the knights to leave as she wanted to speak with the man alone. Wellington sat opposite the girl and rather tensely asked if she really knew him. Lydia answered in the affirmative, but refused to say how exactly she knew him. She admitted that it might seem suspicious to him that she knew him well, even though she was completely unknown to him. But this, according to the girl, didn't matter. What was important was only that she was ready to pay off his card debts. Such a statement didn't just surprise Wellington, it shocked him. But Lydia added that she wouldn't do it for nothing, and from now on, he would be forbidden from selling illegal medicines. Furthermore, the girl wanted him to go with her to the border and work there as a healer. There was only one healer at the border, but even he relied on folk remedies, so someone with more professional knowledge was desperately needed there. And although Wellington was very grateful to the priestess, he didn't understand why she would give such an opportunity to a man like him. He saw no benefit in any of it, but Lydia thought otherwise. Because the border needed a healer, and no one but him would want to go so far away. Moreover, according to the girl, she was just thinking about starting some kind of business. Having piqued Wellington's interest, Lydia confessed that she knew how to cure the white spirit's disease. Initially, the heroine didn't plan to rush this, but now she decided to quickly deal with it and use the money to support the front. However, it suddenly turned out that Wellington already knew about the yellow dandelions. He stated that if it was about them, then rumors about it had already spread everywhere. Meanwhile, it turned out that the news of treating the white spirit's disease with yellow dandelions delighted everyone except Giselle. Marquis Evans, who was on the verge of death, returned to the capital, along with rumors that it was his daughter who had cured him of his illness. The reason Giselle could easily take that place was that Lydia's reputation was at rock bottom. Everyone considered her better than the Marquis's depraved daughter, who was obsessed with men. But now the situation had changed, and if Lydia's reputation improved, rumors about Giselle could start spreading. Considering that the imperial wedding was just around the corner, this could become a problem, especially since Giselle had never managed to acquire Evans Castle. Some time ago, she paid a personal visit to the Marquis on Richard's orders. She reported that she had heard that Mr. Evans had opposed her official adoption. Giselle admitted that she was wrong and began to convince him that she was not trying to take Lydia's place at all, and that everything just turned out that way. The Marquis replied that he understood everything, and that a person's heart often goes out of their control. Giselle had already started to rejoice, but Evans suddenly added that the reason for his refusal was not that at all. According to him, the matter was that she was simply the kind of person who doesn't know gratitude. The Marquis took her in and raised her purely out of a sense of kinship, but during his illness, she never once showed up, and for the sake of decency, didn't even send a healer. Evans believed that Giselle must have wished for his death so that it would be easier to manipulate his foolish son. The girl tried to convince him that she did not wish him dead, and that Devon was not the kind of person she could influence at all. However, the Marquis was firm in his opinion and was sure that she would try to take their castle and seize their family. Therefore, Evans regretfully announced that he could not allow this to happen. Giselle understood there was no chance the Marquis would change his mind, and since she had lost the opportunity to acquire the castle, she decided to deprive the Evanses of something as well. She ordered her assistant Alice to plant yellow mountain dandelions in the imperial garden and prepare a cure for the white ghost disease. Lydia, of course, could take credit for discovering this cure, and Giselle herself decided to become the one who would destroy this disease, personally distributing this medicine to all people in the empire.